Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Domitrovic. It's great to be here at scenic Utah Valley University. I want to talk about federalism in the 19th century compared to the 20th century, and I'm going to ask whether or not we want federalism, and I'm not sure what the answer is. The aspiration the Constitution has to a more perfect union derived in good part, no doubt, from one particular experience in the 1780s, the era of the Articles of Confederation. This was the experience of trade barriers between states, and we've heard a little bit about this today already. These trade barriers took the form of duties on merchandise shipped into one state from another, state mandates that favored state businesses over those from out of state, and sovereignty grabs on the border rivers. The latter was the issue at the heart of the case we just heard about, the classical Commerce Clause case in constitutional history, Gibbons v. Ogden of 1824. In that case, the Supreme Court determined that the Hudson River could be plied by ferries from both New Jersey and New York. Neither state could advantage the ferry companies of its own state when it came to access of the river ports. By the way, I recommend my colleague Tom Cox's book on Gibbons v. Ogden. The more perfect union envisioned by the document of 1787 included the elimination of all these things of the 1780s, of interstate tariffs and all the rest, in that the Constitution gave to Congress the exclusive power to regulate interstate commerce. These are the words that make up what we choose to call the Constitution's Commerce Clause. We are inclined perhaps to see the great prospering that unfolded in this nation over the decades following 1789 as a vindication of, among other things, the Commerce Clause. If the United States had not prohibited such things as internal tariffs in 1789, surely economic growth would not have taken hold as it did. The barriers to domestic economic activity would have been too severe for good economic growth to have ever taken off. I think we should be careful about subscribing to this view, which is a common one across the mentality of the American people throughout this nation's history. Certain things were discarded with the elimination of internal trade barriers that may have been useful to have extant. One of these was the impost, such as Rhode Island included within its tax system in the 1780s. An impost is a uniform value-added tax put on all imports, usually at a low rate, such as 5%. It is distinguished from a tariff, which is a list of specific taxes, specific duties on specific imports. The main form of federal revenue for the 125 years after 1789 was the Congressional Tariff. Its specificity caused no end of lobbying in Congress and corrupted that institution in simply unbearable ways. The specificity that was essential to a tariff prompted businesses to seek congressional protection of their own interests in a way that the impost could never have on account of the impost's generality and uniformity. You could not lobby Congress to put a tariff duty on the good you made given an impost because the impost was a flat rate on everything. If you could imagine it, Rhode Island had been able to keep its impost after 1789, the nation could have seen with its own eyes how that alternative would have worked out. If the state impost succeeded by virtue of Rhode Island's prospering, it would have represented a salutary example that the nation would want to consider emulating. With the elimination of internal trade barriers, thanks to the Commerce Clause, however, all arguments about the external trade barriers, about the Congressional Tariff, had to take place without the wisdom of various counterexamples from the states. This was probably a loss to 19th century political economy. Now, perhaps the alternative 19th century I am outlining to you here is familiar to you. Perhaps it seems like it is our own world, the America of the 20th and 21st centuries, in which we are likely to hear that the states in their different economic policies are laboratories of democracy. This is, in fact, what we do here, and for good reason. States strive today to be competitive against each other in contemporary times by having different economic policies so as to distinguish the opportunities available in comparison to other states. Today, states will have such distinct tax and regulatory environments that the idea that in any de facto sense there are not functional in-country trade barriers, that de jure commerce clause, is an untenable proposition. I mean, with all the differences in state tax and regulation, how could we possibly say that commerce is uniform across the states? For example, there are 9 states today without an income tax. There are several states with very large income tax systems. Florida and Texas have no income tax, while California and New York have most major ones. Both of the latter, taking into account localities, having rates topping out comfortably over 10%. When a $100 million a year resident moves from New Jersey to Florida, for example, the tax hit in New Jersey, an income tax state, is acute. A good friend of mine is Ford Scudder, who was Chris Christie's Secretary of the Treasury in New Jersey. And he wanted to lower tax rates big time in New Jersey, and he had a list of the 5 people who could not leave New Jersey, and then the state would collapse if they did. And of course, every one of them left, and he quit his job, as he must. Yeah. Christie left. The regulatory environment is just as variable across the 50 states. The primer on these differences is the great book by my mentor, Arthur Laffer, who wrote a book with some collaborators called The Wealth of States. Actually, the full title is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of States, and you get the Adam Smith reference. In this book, you can see all the different ways in which the states differ in their economic environments today. You can compare how their respective legislatures have defined the business environment of each place ununiformly by virtue of tax and regulatory regimes. Generally, we are apt to celebrate today the ability of states to be laboratories of democracy in the contemporary fashion. We may be concerned, perhaps, that taxation is too high in Illinois or California or New York, driving away businesses and inhabitants and making life miserable for those having difficulty bearing its burden. But all the same, we are likely to take comfort in the ability of other states, Utah perhaps, to offer a lesser tax and regulatory burden, giving the inhabitants of the nation as a whole the option to choose economic environments. In the 19th century, the United States had a very high rate of demographic persistence. This is a technical term in demography, meaning the likelihood of persons to live during their adult life in or near the place where they were born. Urbanization, for example, was much more domestically driven in Europe in the 19th century than in the United States, where immigration drove it from abroad. The high rate of demographic persistence in this country 2 centuries ago might be seen as an expression of the high season of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Back then, because state income taxes were rare and the state regulatory apparatus much more slight and reined in by John Marshall's court, following the national example, there was little difference if one moved from state to state. You were probably going to face much the same degree of taxation, property taxation, and the regulatory environment. In the 19th century, there was a consonance between the Constitution's Commerce Clause and the minimal differential of state economic policies. The comparativeness of those state policies reflected the spirit of the Commerce Clause, which said that only the federal body, the Congress, could regulate interstate commerce. How interesting it is, then, that when differential state policies did arise and become a fad, since the 1950s, but particularly since the 1980s, the term that was adopted to describe this new regime was the new federalism. How odd. Ronald Reagan used this term as a matter of course, the new federalism. The new federalism referred to the federal government's keeping quiet about what policies the states should set, and the bolstering through the block grants we heard about, Professor Smith, of the practical ability of the states to set policy on their own. If the old federalism referred to the heyday of the Commerce Clause of the century before, it is worth observing that in that era, federalism referred to few differences among state policies, to relatively common governmental burdens across the states of the nation. The new federalism means the opposite. Now, without question, the economic growth of the United States was greater in the first era than in the second. During the Commerce Clause era, if we may call it that, growth of what we now calculate as 4 or 5% per annum was the norm for exceptionally long periods of time over a century. In the latter period, say since 1913 to today, growth at 4% was never the norm. The most that was achieved at length was just below that. It is, however, difficult to judge which regime is more preferable, which is more constitutional, indeed, which might make for a more perfect union. As for the former period, that of the 19th century, the abrasiveness of tariff politics did, lest we forget, play a significant role in the sectional conflict. And after the Civil War, the tariff question caused no less angst and difficulty and played a role in alienating the bourgeois class from the populace as a whole. We can justly speculate that the great endeavors to knit this nation together across the classes in the early 20th century, counting among these both world wars, were in some sense an attempt to solve domestic social alienation problems that the 19th century tariff had caused. And I'm implying that if we had state imposts in the 19th century, we might have talked ourselves out of a tariff. Yes, I did even suggest we fought World War I and World War II because we didn't have state imposts in the 19th century. Nonetheless, there was that spectacular economic growth. And can you imagine what it would have been like had we had internal trade barriers in the 19th century? Surely the great growth at that time could not have happened. As for the contemporary period, that of markedly different economic, tax, and regulatory policies at the state level, it is a boon that technically nobody is stuck with them. You can move. And move we now do. Our rate of demographic persistence is way up in comparison to historical norms. Whether this is salutary for the nation's social cohesion is not at all clear. That great pre-political institution that is essential to any nation's greatness, that of the extended family, has in many cases ceased to be a functional possibility because of all the moving around that Americans do today. Now, the Roman Empire, for example, would have been nothing without the institution of the extended family. Moreover, the differential state economic policies today bring about a complacency among the states that have bad ones. California characteristically justifies itself by saying, if you don't like how we do things, you're not really California material, are you? Illinois politicians, amazingly, do the same thing. No one can believe that. If the spirit of the 19th century Commerce Clause were more with us today, we would be embarrassed by having different state policies. This, in turn, would undermine the complacency, such as California's, about having bad state policies. Now, a word in favor of the differentiation of state policies today is that they do prove instructive to the federal government. Seeing how taxpayers flee Pennsylvania for non-estate tax states when they are about to die, for example, is telling to the federal government as it contemplates its own policies. Surely one of the reasons we do not have the nosebleed statutory federal tax rates at the top of 91% on income and 77% on estates, as we saw in the 1940s and 1950s, is that the states have shown what happens when you have such equivalence. People get out or otherwise legally avoid such taxation to detrimental economic effects. It is clear that the Constitution does not permit domestic trade barriers, and it is unthinkable that we would want states to be saddled with the same tax and regulatory system, especially if it is California's. These two thoughts are somewhat in opposition, just as they represent the two halves of the history of American political economy with respect to the Commerce Clause and the states over the last 200-some years. We probably need to think harder about which version of these choices would make for the best nation, the more perfect union, as we try to recapture the dynamo nature typically characteristic of the American economy, but which has proven elusive over these first two decades of the 21st century. Thank you.